"You can't be serious, Dad," I said, my voice shaking just enough to betray the anger simmering beneath. I stood across from his massive mahogany desk, the same desk I used to sit under as a child while he worked late into the night. Now, I was on the other side, no longer the little girl who worshipped him, but a woman demanding to be seen. My father leaned back in his leather chair, the picture of calm authority, as if none of this, my future, my place in the family, my entire sense of self, mattered much at all. He slowly set his cigar down in the glass ashtray, a gesture so deliberate it felt like a full stop. "This isn't up for discussion, Catherine," he said, his voice smooth and even, as though I were a client asking for an unreasonable favor. My nails dug into my palms, but I refused to fold. "So, that's it?" I asked, the sharp edge creeping into my voice. "You're just handing everything to Grant, someone who couldn't care less about this firm, and locking me out entirely. And why? Because I'm your daughter instead of your son?" He didn't even blink. "This firm is your brother's legacy," he said, each word clipped and final. "You've done well with your schooling. You'll make a fine wife to someone important one day, but Mercer and Associates is not for you." My name is Catherine Mercer, and at 26, I'm a Harvard-educated lawyer, and the daughter of Henry Mercer, founder and patriarch of one of the most powerful law firms in Dallas. I grew up learning the law like other kids learned bedtime stories. While my classmates were playing with dolls, I was memorizing legal precedents and watching my father debate circles around his peers. Everything I've done, every late-night study session, every accolade I earned, was for this. To follow him into the firm, to carry the Mercer name into the future. But here I was, standing in the office I'd idolized my whole life, being told none of it mattered. I didn't sit down. I stood tall, hands flat on his desk, willing him to see me. "Grant doesn't care about this firm," I said, my voice quieter but no less fierce. "He's careless, Dad. You know that. He barely made it through community college. He doesn't even like the law. He likes the power and the money that comes with your name." My father sighed, rubbing his temple like I was exhausting him. "Grant will learn. He's my son. It's his birthright. You," he added, softening just slightly. "You have other options, Catherine. Easier options. A life with less stress, fewer battles." A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. "Less stress? What do you think I've been doing for the past 10 years? Everything I've done. Harvard, internships, graduating at the top of my class. I did all of that to prove I was ready for this, and you're throwing it all away." He stood up slowly, signaling that the conversation was over. "This is my decision," he said simply. "I'm protecting you, even if you don't see it that way." I walked out without another word, past the polished wood paneling and the family portraits lining the hallway. My mother was in the parlor, arranging fresh roses like she always did when she didn't want to be involved. She looked up, eyes full of unspoken concern. "Catherine?" she asked softly. "What's wrong?" I stopped in the doorway, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad's giving the firm to Grant. I'm being sidelined." Her hands faltered over the vase, and her smile, the one she wore like armor, slipped. "Your father only wants what's best for you," she said too carefully. He thinks I'm too fragile," I snapped. "He thinks I'm just here to marry well and show up at charity galas, not run the firm I've been preparing for my whole life." Her expression flickered between sadness and helplessness. "It's how things have always been, sweetheart." I shook my head. "Not for me." That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my father's words looping in my mind. I thought about all the weekends I spent shadowing him at the firm, all the times I impressed his partners only for them to say, "You'll make some lawyer a wonderful wife one day." I thought about how I'd believed, Foolishly it seemed now, that if I was good enough, worked hard enough, even he would have to see me. The next morning I packed. Halfway through folding my suits into a sleek black suitcase, my bedroom door creaked open. My mother stood there, her brow furrowed. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. Before I could answer, my father appeared behind her, brows drawn low. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" His voice was low, expectant. From the hallway, Grant sauntered in wearing his silk robe, a smirk plastered on his face. "Vacation, sis. You need some time to cool off?" I zipped the suitcase with a sharp tug and turned to face them. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "You've made it clear I don't have a future here. I'll find somewhere I do." My father's expression darkened, my mother's hands fluttered nervously, and Grant just grinned wider, as if this was all some amusing show. "Don't be dramatic, Catherine," my father said, voice stern. "This is your home." I shook my head. "No, Dad, it's your home, a place where Grant is king and I'm just another accessory. I'm done fighting to be part of something that doesn't want me." Grant chuckled. "God, you're so intense. Lighten up, Cat." I turned to him, steel in my voice. "Enjoy your kingdom, Grant. Try not to burn it down." My father called after me, but I was already heading down the grand staircase, suitcase bumping against the marble steps. My mother's voice followed me. "Catherine, please, let's talk about this." I paused at the door. "I love you, Mom," I said softly, "but I'm done talking." My father stood at the top of the stairs, arms crossed, silent. Grant leaned lazily against the banister, unbothered. I opened the door and stepped into the bright morning sun, the weight on my shoulders somehow lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be the perfect daughter. I was just me, and I was free. Within days, I had an interview at Hayes & Sutton, one of Dallas's most prestigious firms. They didn't care about my last name. They cared about my work, my mind, my drive. When they offered me a position by the end of the week, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. The work was grueling, but it felt good. It felt like mine. There were nights I missed home, missed my mother's quiet presence, and even Grant's infuriating antics. But what I never missed was the feeling of being invisible, of fighting for scraps of respect that never came. Out here, in my own world, I was more than Henry Mercer's daughter. I was Catherine Mercer, and I was building something real. A few months later, Richard Hayes, my mentor at the firm, called me into his office. "There's a case I want you to lead," he said. "High profile, it's going to put you on the map." I leaned forward, ready for the challenge. "What's the case?" He smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "It's against Mercer and Associates." For a moment I didn't breathe, then I smiled back. "I'm ready," I said. He hesitated briefly before continuing, his hands folded neatly on his desk. "We are representing a client in a major litigation against Mercer and Associates. Your father's firm is being sued for negligence in a high-value contract dispute. The stakes are huge, and the case is already drawing attention from the press and the local legal community." The words hung in the air, heavier than I expected. My stomach knotted, my mind struggling to catch up. "You want me," I said carefully, "to represent someone suing my father's firm?" Richard met my gaze without flinching. "I know it's personal, Catherine, but that's exactly why you're the right person for this. You know how Mercer and Associates operates, how your father thinks, and you're one of the sharpest attorneys we have. If anyone can win this case, it's you." I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "Richard," I said, my voice measured, "you understand what you're asking, right? This isn't just a professional challenge, it's my family. If I do this, I'm not sure there's any coming back from it." He leaned forward, elbows resting on his desk. "I know," he said, his voice gentler now, "but This is also your chance to prove that you don't need their name, their approval, or their firm to succeed. You have the skills. Let them see exactly who they underestimated. I sat back, hands clasped tightly in my lap. The conflict inside me churned, pulling me in two directions. This was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. High stakes, high visibility, the kind of case that could define a career. But it also meant burning the last fragile thread connecting me to my family. "Can I sleep on it?" I asked, my voice quieter now. Richard nodded, his understanding clear. "Of course, but don't take too long. We need to move fast if we want to stay ahead of opposing counsel. Let me know by tomorrow." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my apartment. My mind raced through every possible consequence. Taking the case meant going head to head with my father, the man who had dismissed me like I was nothing. It meant exposing Grant's incompetence in court, where everyone could see just how unprepared he was to inherit the firm. And it meant showing the legal community and my family that I wasn't some cast-off daughter destined to marry well. I was a damn good lawyer, with or without the Mercer name. But it also meant driving a wedge into what little remained of my relationship with my mother. And despite everything, I wasn't sure I was ready to lose that. The next morning, I walked into Richard's office with my shoulders back and my head high. "I'll take the case," I said simply, a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Good," he said, with the kind of quiet confidence that made me trust I'd made the right call. "Let's get to work." The day of the first hearing came faster than I expected. I stood outside the courtroom, my briefcase clutched in one hand, my heart pounding against my ribs. My client, calm and composed, offered a brief nod of encouragement. I returned it, but all I could think about was the moment I knew was coming, the moment my father and Grant saw me sitting across from them. The courtroom was already half filled when I stepped inside. My heels clicked sharply against the polished floor, the sound too loud in the silence. I made my way to our table, set down my briefcase, and turned. There they were. My father, his suit as crisp and intimidating as ever, sat at the defendant's table. Grant, fidgeting with a pen, lounged beside him. Their eyes locked onto me at the same time, and the flicker of recognition in my father's face was almost imperceptible. But it was there. Grant, on the other hand, openly gawked for a split second before covering it with a forced smirk. I held their stares, unflinching. I wasn't the daughter begging for a seat at the table anymore. I was opposing counsel, and they were just another case. For a brief moment I thought I saw something soften in my father's eyes, but just as quickly it was gone. He leaned toward Grant, whispering something. Grant's smirk faltered, and I didn't care what they said. I wasn't here for their approval. I was here to win. The proceedings began, and I slipped into my role with the ease of someone who had been preparing for this her entire life. Every motion I filed, every argument I presented was delivered with precision and confidence. I didn't allow myself to waver, even when Grant stumbled through his responses, or my father's gaze bore into me like a weight. I was calm, professional, and relentless. Grant's inexperience was glaringly obvious. He misspoke, misquoted, and bumbled through objections like a first-year associate. Every time he faltered, I countered with facts, precedents, and case law so airtight there was no room for debate. Each time I corrected him, his frustration grew more visible, his composure slipping piece by piece. My father tried to intervene, but even he couldn't undo the damage Grant was doing. With each hearing, my client's case grew stronger, and Mercer and Associates' credibility crumbled a little more. I didn't relish watching Grant fail. I wasn't cruel, but I also didn't save him. If they wanted to hand him the firm, they could also let him sink it. By the fourth session, Mercer and Associates proposed a settlement. I reviewed the terms, handed back a few revisions, and waited. When my father's counsel accepted, I knew we'd won. As the final paperwork was signed, I looked across the table and met my father's gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, no pride either, just a tired kind of resignation. Grant, on the other hand, couldn't even look at me. His bravado was gone, replaced by a sullen silence. I didn't say a word to either of them. I didn't need to. The work was done, and I had proven exactly what they had refused to believe. I didn't need their firm, their approval, or their legacy to succeed. I had built something of my own, and for the first time they saw it with their own eyes. As I gathered my files, my father stood. For a fleeting moment I thought he might say something, might offer some last-minute apology, or at least acknowledgement. But he just nodded, barely, before turning to leave. It wasn't closure, but it was enough. I walked out of that courtroom taller than I'd ever felt. That night, Richard took me to dinner to celebrate. "You were flawless," he said, raising a glass to me, "and you proved something today, not just to them, but to yourself." I smiled, though the victory tasted bittersweet. "I guess I did," I said softly. The next morning, a bouquet of roses was waiting on my desk. There was no note, but I didn't need one. My mother's touch was unmistakable, soft, elegant, just like her. A small, silent acknowledgement that even if my father and Grant couldn't see my worth, she could. I ran my fingers over the petals, then placed the vase beside my framed law degree. I had found my place. And for the first time in my life, it was mine alone. Usually, after a hearing, I would stay behind to wrap up with my client and exchange pleasantries with opposing counsel. It was a small ritual, one of those professional courtesies I believed in, no matter how contentious the case had been. But this time, there was no opportunity. My father and Grant had already packed up their things and left without so much as a glance in my direction. No handshake, no acknowledgement, not even a stiff, "well done." It stung more than I wanted to admit. Even after everything, even after proving them wrong in front of a room full of legal professionals, a small part of me had hoped for something. A nod, a look, some tiny crack in their armour that might suggest they saw me, not just as their adversary, but as someone worthy of respect. But there was nothing, just silence. I took a breath, shoved the disappointment aside, and turned my attention back to my client. I'd won the case. That was what mattered. That evening, when I walked back into the firm, the response couldn't have been more different. My colleagues greeted me with applause, smiling faces filling the corridor. Richard was the first to approach, his hand clapping my shoulder with unmistakable pride. "Outstanding work, Catherine," he said, raising a glass of champagne someone had managed to procure. "That was a textbook victory. You were prepared, strategic, and absolutely relentless." The team had even thrown together a small celebration in the break room. Nothing fancy, just some drinks, hors d'oeuvres, and a lot of proud faces. My client stopped by as well, shaking my hand firmly. "We couldn't have asked for a better lawyer," they said warmly. "You fought for us like it was personal." Because it was, I thought, but I just smiled. "Thank you. It was my pleasure." For the first time that day, I let myself relax. Surrounded by people who valued me for my talent, not my last name, I felt a sense of belonging that no Mercer boardroom had ever given me. This was my victory. I'd earned it, and I owned every second of it. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I sat by the window with a glass of wine, watching the Dallas skyline flicker against the dark. The adrenaline had long faded, leaving me alone with my thoughts. And, as much as I didn't want to admit it, my mind drifted back to my father and Grant. I replayed the hearing, every glance, every unspoken reaction. I had expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even arrogance, but it was the silence they left me with that hurt the most. They had nothing to say, not to congratulate me, not to acknowledge my win, not even to challenge me. For years, I'd chased my father's respect like it was the finish line at the end of some endless race. I thought winning that case would be the proof I needed, the thing that would finally make him see me for who I was. But now, after standing toe-to-toe with him in court and walking away victorious, I realized I still had no idea what he saw when he looked at me. A formidable opponent? A daughter who betrayed him? Or maybe just a reminder of his own mistakes? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. The next morning, I was barely settled at my desk when Richard appeared, looking both curious and cautious. "Catherine," he said, his voice low, "your father's here." I froze. "My father?" Richard nodded. "He's waiting in your office. Said he wanted to speak with you." He gave me a quick, encouraging smile. "Take your time, I'll hold your calls." I thanked him, though my mind was already racing as I walked down the hall. The last time I'd faced my father alone was in that study, when he told me I'd never have a place at Mercer and Associates. And now, after everything, he was sitting in my office, waiting for me. I opened the door, and there he was, Henry Mercer, seated in the chair across from my desk, his hands clasped, his expression unreadable. But there was something there, something in the slight furrow of his brow, the set of his shoulders. Regret maybe, or something close to it. "Catherine," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I closed the door behind me, keeping my posture neutral. "Dad," I replied evenly. "What brings you here?" He stood smoothing his suit jacket, a gesture so familiar it made my stomach flip. "I came to talk," he said quietly, "to say some things I should have said a long time ago." I moved to my desk, setting my bag down carefully. "All right," I said, arms crossing instinctively. "I'm listening." He glanced toward the window as though looking for the right words somewhere out there. "You were brilliant in that courtroom," he began, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "I've seen a lot of lawyers in my day, some of the best, and what you did, it was remarkable. You were sharp, prepared, and relentless. There was never any doubt you were the better lawyer." The compliment caught me off guard, but I stayed silent, waiting for what came next. "I spent my whole life believing that legacy meant handing down the firm to my son," he continued, his voice tinged with regret. "I thought keeping tradition alive meant preserving the old ways, fathers to sons. But I see now how wrong I was. Grant isn't ready. Maybe he never will be, but you've proven you're more than ready." He ran a hand through his silver hair, the gesture suddenly making him seem older. "I failed you, Catherine. I didn't give you the recognition you deserved, and I see that now. I'm sorry." The words hung between us, heavy and unfamiliar. I searched his face, looking for some sign that this was genuine, and for the first time, I saw it. "Why now?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Why are you saying this after everything?" His gaze didn't waver. "Because I saw you in that courtroom, and I realized I couldn't deny it anymore. You're the future of Mercer and Associates, Catherine. If you'll come back, I want you to take your rightful place." The offer landed softly, but its weight was immense. For so long, I had dreamed of hearing those words. And yet, now that they were here, they didn't feel the way I expected. "What about Grant?" I asked. "He'll stay," my father said, his tone more businesslike. "But he'll have a role that suits him. This isn't about Grant, it's about you." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "I need time," I said, keeping my voice calm. This isn't something I can decide right away." "I understand," my father said, his voice softer again. "Take all the time you need." He started toward the door but paused just before leaving. "One more thing," he said. "I'm proud of you, Catherine, more than I've ever said. You're a better lawyer than I ever was." The words struck harder than I expected, leaving me speechless. He gave me a small, hesitant smile, then left the office. I sat at my desk, staring at the empty doorway, his words echoing in my head. Better than I ever was. For so long, I'd been chasing his approval, fighting to prove my worth, and now I had it. But the question remained, was it too late? That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My father's offer was everything I'd wanted, but it came with a price. Going back meant stepping into a world where I'd once been cast aside. Staying here meant building something new, something entirely mine. I haven't made up my mind yet. The choice feels impossible, and it's keeping me awake. But maybe you can help. What would you do? Would you go back and claim your place in the legacy you were born into, or would you stay and build a new one from scratch? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts.